the echoes of a new frontier, the old world's shadow and the lure of liberty. The salt spray from the Atlantic was a constant icy whip across Elias Thorne's face, yet he welcomed the sting. It was a tangible, biting reminder that the past, the suffocating, rigid past of Cornwall, was receding with every knot the brig, the Providence, cut through the unforgiving sea. For 6 weeks he had lived on a diet of stale biscuits and prayer, his young wife, Clara, huddled beside him, her hand a cool, steady weight in his calloused one. Their destination was the Massachusetts Bay Colony, a place Elias had only known through pamphlets that painted a landscape of boundless opportunity and religious freedom. But for Elias, it was less about God's grace and more about escaping the king's shadow. Elias had been a promising stonemason, his hands possessing a craftsman's precision. He had even been granted the honor of working on the local baron's new manor. Yet the life of a tradesman, no matter how skilled, was perpetually bound to the whims of the aristocracy. When the baron's son, a pampered, entitled youth, had demanded Elias abandon a crucial prepaid job to fix his dog's kennel and then threatened debtor's prison when Elias refused, the truth had settled in Elias's gut like a stone. In England, a man's worth was measured not by his labor, but by his lineage. "Are you cold, Elias?" Clara's voice was a soft, anxious tremor. She pulled the thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, the dark wool doing little to fend off the raw maritime air. She looked out at the endless horizon, the churning gray water reflecting the turmoil she kept caged inside. He shook his head, though his bones ached with damp chill. "No, my love, just thinking about the warrants, the memory of the bailiff's smug face and the hasty whispered warning from his own uncle still burned. He hadn't just refused the baron's son. In a fit of righteous fury, he had broken the youth's favorite ornamental sundial, a petty, expensive act of defiance that had sealed their fate. They were not mere hopeful immigrants seeking a better wage. They were fugitives seeking amnesty in a place where old titles held no currency. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. "Do you believe what the captain says? That the land is open? That we will truly own our labor?" The lure of liberty, the phrase printed on the emigration flyers, was a powerful drug. It promised a stark, radical difference from the inherited hierarchy they were fleeing. In the new world, a man could clear a field, build a house, and stand on his own soil, beholden to no lord or bishop. This was the true engine driving the thousands who crammed the decks of these vessels. The hunger for autonomy, the chance to be a primary source, not a mere secondary function. Captain Davies says that when a man clears a tree in the Bay Colony, that patch of ground is his provided he works it, Elias murmured, his eyes fixed on a distant soaring albatross. "He says there are no barons there, Clara, only townsfolk and the wilderness. But the wilderness itself was an unseen, formidable threat, and the townsfolk, though free from royal rule, were often bound by a stringent, unforgiving Puritan dogma that could be just as restrictive. Elias was a man of quiet conviction, not dogmatic zeal. His liberty was secular, the freedom to pursue life, liberty, and the fruit of his own hands, unimpeded by an ancestral decree. He intended to be a landholder and a master of his own destiny, a prospect utterly unattainable under the old world's shadow. As the days blended into weeks, the desperation of the cramped ship intensified. Sickness spread, and the initial bright hope of some passengers dimmed into weary resignation. Yet, whenever doubt threatened to engulf him, Elias would look at the small, tightly rolled deed they had purchased in secret. A tiny plot of land near the settlement of Dorchester. It was a promissory note for a life unburdened. Then, one cold, clear dawn, a cry went up from the crow's nest. "Land ho!" A faint, dark line materialized on the western horizon. It wasn't the manicured fields or ancient stone castles of England. It was rugged, dense, and vast, an intimidating expanse of unbroken forest and rock. It was a continent waiting, and as Elias looked upon this dark, promised edge of the earth, he knew the easy part. The sailing was over. The true fight for his liberty, for the right to build a life free from the European caste system, was only just beginning. He squeezed Clara's hand, a silent vow passing between them. They had reached the soil of the lure of liberty. Understood. Building directly upon the previous section, here is the next 800-word segment of the story, using the subtitle, A Wilderness Unyielding, the First Trial. A Wilderness Unyielding. The First Trial. The shore of Massachusetts Bay was not the promised golden strand of the pamphlets. It was a rough, muddy scramble of stones, driftwood, and tangled roots. The air, heavy with the sharp, clean scent of pine and brine, promised purity, but the land itself offered nothing freely. Elias and Clara disembarked at Dorchester, a settlement less a town and more a tenacious collection of rough-hewn cabins clinging to the edge of an immense, hostile forest. The first trial was immediate, finding shelter. The established settlers, having endured the first crippling winters, were wary and tight-lipped. They offered no easy charity, for survival demanded a fierce self-reliance. The only kindness Elias received was the curt direction to the northern edge of the settlement, where their purchased land lay, a small, unimproved rectangle of earth choked with ancient oaks and granite boulders. It was a deed on paper, but a challenge in reality. Elias paid a local carpenter, a gruff man named Samuel, a substantial portion of their remaining shillings to haul their few possessions, a worn chest, a sturdy axe, and their precious tools to their plot. When they arrived, Elias stared at the dense wall of trees. The sun barely penetrated the canopy. The ground was a damp, uneven tapestry of moss and deadfall. "This ain't London, lad," Samuel said, spitting tobacco juice onto the moss. "No manor houses waiting. You got maybe 6 weeks of fair weather left. If ye ain't got a roof before the first snow, you'll be sharing a grave with the squirrels." He pointed the blunt end of his whip at the forest. "Clear it, build it. Pray it holds." With those stark words, Samuel left. Elias looked at Clara, whose face was pale with exhaustion and a fear she was trying hard to hide. "It is better than the Baron's shadow," Elias asserted, his voice perhaps a little too loud, trying to convince himself as much as her. "It is ours, Clara. Every tree we fell, every stone we move, it is for us." The work was brutal. Elias, the skilled stonemason, found his tools inadequate against the primeval resistance of the American wilderness. The trees were monumental, their roots woven through the rocky soil like iron cables. His axe, a familiar extension of his arm in England, felt foreign and heavy here. Hours bled into days, marked only by the agonizing sound of steel biting wood and the thud of felled timber. His hands, once admired for their artistry, blistered and bled until the skin hardened into thick, aching leather. Clara worked alongside him with a silent, fierce determination. While Elias battled the forest, she meticulously cleared the brush, foraged for edible roots and berries, and, crucially, began stacking the countless stones Elias pulled from the earth. They used a salvaged ship's tarp for meager nightly cover, and the silence of the woods was broken only by the crackle of their small fire and the unnerving alien calls of night creatures. Every single day was a battle for inches of ground. The greatest trial, however, was not the physical strain, but the relentless sense of isolation. The vastness of the American forest made England seem like a crowded pantry. They were alone, utterly dependent on their own dwindling stores and stamina. One late afternoon, while splitting a stubborn oak log, Elias misjudged the swing. The axe glanced off a knot, slicing a deep gash into his thigh. He collapsed, the pain a white, searing wave. Clara rushed to him, her usually calm demeanor fractured by panic. The wound bled profusely. Infections were common and often fatal in the colony. A simple cut could mean a lonely death in the wilderness. The sulfur, Elias gasped, pointing weakly toward their chest. "Grandmother's remedy." Clara, her hands trembling but her mind focusing, used a clean piece of linen to staunch the bleeding, then painstakingly mixed a poultice of powdered sulfur and a little brandy, a crude, desperate measure. For 3 days, Elias lay shivering under the tarp, feverish and weak, unable to work. During those days, Clara became the sole keeper of their fragile hope. She kept the fire burning, nursed his wound, and even attempted to finish the notching on the 2 logs Elias had prepared for the cabin frame. When the fever finally broke, leaving Elias weak but alive, he looked at his wife, her face smudged with soot and dirt. Her eyes ringed with exhaustion, and understood the true meaning of the New World's liberty. It was not a gift of ease, but a relentless demand for strength. He had thought escaping the Baron's shadow was the victory. He now knew it was merely the entry fee. The true test lay in subduing this unyielding wilderness, not just with muscle, but with an iron will forged in shared adversity. They had survived their first trial, but as the autumn air turned sharper, promising the imminent arrival of winter, Elias knew the woods were preparing to issue their ultimate challenge. Unlikely alliances and whispers of conflict, Elias's recovery from the axe wound was slow, measured in the small mercy of pain's recession and the gradual regaining of strength. The incident, however, served as a brutal lesson. Independence was a noble ideal, but isolation in the wilderness was suicide. With winter rapidly approaching, Elias and Clara knew they could not survive alone. They returned to the edge of Dorchester settlement, not begging, but offering a service. Elias, his legs still stiff, bartered his dwindling supply of superior English steel for grain and an audience. He found his first unlikely partner in Jedediah Morse, a gaunt, fiercely pious man who viewed the Massachusetts Bay Colony as God's proving ground. Jedediah had the land and the theological fire, but lacked the practical building skills necessary to secure his family through the winter. "Your hands, man," Jedediah observed, inspecting Elias's calloused palms with a narrow gaze. "They tell a tale of craftsmanship, not piety. But a sturdy roof keeps out the devil's cold just as well as prayer." Elias held his tongue regarding Jedediah's harsh Puritan zeal, focusing instead on the transaction. Elias would help finish Jedediah's cabin and secure his firewood in exchange for a temporary room for Clara and him, and a share of Jedediah's tools and oxen. It was a purely pragmatic exchange, a truce between a skeptical craftsman and a devout zealot. This unlikely alliance, born not of friendship, but mutual necessity, became Elias's lifeline back to the world of men. While working for Jedediah, Elias overheard the whispers of conflict that ran through the small settlement like a cold draft. The primary tension was not internal but external, directed at the original inhabitants of the land. The Narragansett and Pequot tribes were a constant, powerful presence just beyond the cleared fields. They were the masters of this wilderness Elias struggled against, and their growing displeasure with the colonists' relentless expansion was evident in every hushed conversation. "They take our deer, Mr. Thorne," Jedediah muttered one afternoon, pausing his chopping. "They trespass across land that God granted to the true believers. They do not comprehend the concept of ownership, only of shifting claims." Elias remembered a fleeting encounter days earlier. While dragging logs, he had seen a native man standing silently at the edge of his plot. The man, tall and clad in deerskin, had watched him for several long moments with an expression that was neither hostile nor welcoming, but profoundly appraising. Then he simply vanished into the forest. Elias felt a deep, unsettling intuition. The native people did not see the colonists as brave pioneers. They saw them as a creeping, insatiable disease. This unspoken tension reached a head when a small, critical detail of their survival was challenged: access to the river. The local river was vital for fishing and transport. The colonists, led by an elder named Captain Prescott, had decided to unilaterally restrict native access to a specific bend in the river, claiming it was essential for their own winter fishing stock. This action was met with immediate, chilling resistance. One evening, a group of 4 Narragansett men appeared at the settlement's edge, not with weapons, but with quiet, authoritative firmness. Their spokesman, whose name Elias later learned was Woonigan, spoke through a nervous, half-fluent translator. "The river is older than your king," Woonigan stated, his voice low but carrying absolute authority. "It flows for all who drink. You take the water, you take the soil, and soon you will take the air we breathe. This river bend is shared. Do not touch the fishing weirs." Captain Prescott, puffing out his chest with self-righteous anger, responded with legal jargon and biblical citations about dominion over the earth. The exchange was a masterclass in misunderstanding. Elias watched from the shadow of Jedediah's cabin, feeling a profound sense of unease. The English viewed the land as a commodity to be owned and fenced. The natives viewed it as a living entity to be shared. Their definitions of liberty were fundamentally incompatible. Woonigan and his men left silently, but the threat hung heavy in the damp autumn air. Jedediah immediately rallied a watch, loading muskets and speaking of the impending savagery. "They are heathens, Elias. They do not understand reason. They only understand strength," Jedediah insisted, cleaning his flintlock. Elias, however, felt a pull toward Woonigan's measured defiance. He understood the feeling of an old power, arbitrarily imposing its will. He had fled the Baron's tyranny only to land among a people who were, in turn, imposing a new tyranny on the native inhabitants. The realization was stark. He had escaped one oppressive shadow only to step into another brewing conflict. His dream of simple autonomy was colliding violently with the brutal reality of colonial expansion. The frontier was not just a wilderness, it was a contested ground, and Elias would soon be forced to choose a side, absolutely. Here is the 800-word segment under the subtitle, "The Turning Tide, A Moment of Reckoning," where the building tensions finally erupt into the central climax of the narrative. The turning tide. A moment of reckoning. The tension over the river had been a tight, humming wire stretched between the two communities. It took only a spark to snap it. That spark came not from a hostile encounter, but from a tragedy misinterpreted. 3 weeks after the standoff, just as the last leaves were falling, 2 young boys from the Dorchester settlement, foraging for late-season chestnuts, failed to return. Captain Prescott, the self-appointed military leader, immediately declared them abducted by the Narragansett. Jedediah Morse, fueled by fear and biblical certainty, was the first to take up arms. The whispers of conflict instantly transformed into a clamor for war. Elias, still living under Jedediah's precarious roof, felt a paralyzing dread. He had been promised liberty, yet here he was, trapped in a colonial conflict that echoed the mindless, brutal struggles of the old world he had fled. He did not trust Prescott, whose self-interest often masked as piety. Nor did he trust the quick, bloodthirsty verdict against the Narragansett. They must be punished. "Elias," Jedediah hissed, loading his musket with a practiced hand, "the Lord requires vengeance for the innocent. You are a strong man. You must join the patrol." Elias hesitated. "We have no proof, Jedediah. Have we searched the river? The swamps? The forest hides their villainy. Do not let doubt make you a coward in the eyes of the Lord." Refusing to join the immediate hunt, Elias took his axe and went to the river bend, a place that felt strangely neutral, a silent witness to the growing hostilities. He was looking not for tracks, but for a reason, a sign of what truly happened. It was there, near the restricted fishing weir, that Elias stumbled upon an object that changed everything. A small, handmade wooden boat, painted with crude images of birds, clearly belonging to the missing boys, half submerged in the muck. Beside it, the soil was soft and disturbed. They hadn't been taken. They had drowned. The river, the wilderness unyielding, had claimed them. At that same moment, Captain Prescott led a small, heavily armed patrol, including a fervent Jedediah, directly toward a known Narragansett hunting camp, intent on demanding the boys' return or exacting retribution. This was it. The turning tide. Elias scrambled up the bank, running back toward the settlement, the wooden boat clutched in his hand. He had to stop them. He ran past the newly cleared fields, ignoring the pain shooting up his healing leg, driven by the terrifying realization that an innocent massacre was imminent, fueled by fear and falsehood. He reached the edge of the woods just as the patrol was about to enter the camp clearing. Prescott was shouting threats, his musket raised. On the other side stood a group of Narragansett, including Woonigan, bows drawn, their faces masks of grim defiance. The standoff was complete. A single trigger pull would ignite the war. "Stop!" Elias roared, stumbling into the clearing, breathless. His voice, strained from exhaustion, cut through the silence. Prescott whirled, enraged. "Thorn, what madness is this? Step aside." Elias held up the muddy, childlike boat. "The boys are dead. They drowned in the river. They were not taken. Look!" He threw the small boat into the dirt at Prescott's feet. The sight of the fragile toy, a testament to the boy's innocence, stalled the action. Jedediah stared at the boat, his face slowly draining of color. His righteous fury giving way to a sickening doubt. Wonigan, seeing the object and understanding the sudden shift in the colonist's demeanor, lowered his bow slightly. He spoke quickly to the translator. The translator turned, his voice shaking. Wonigan says, "They saw the small boat days ago. They thought it was lost. They would not take children. We take warriors, not children. Wonigan says the deep water takes what it wants." The collective realization that their hatred, their preparedness for war was based on a lie, was a heavy blow. Prescott, unable to absorb the humiliation and the collapse of his authority, stood frozen. Jedediah, however, lowered his musket, his hands trembling. He had been ready to commit murder in God's name, only to be stopped by the man he distrusted. For Elias, this was the moment of reckoning. He had risked everything, his temporary safety, his fragile alliance with Jedediah, and perhaps his life, to uphold a truth that transcended the colonial fear. He had done what he felt was right, not what was easy or expected. By refusing to join the mob, he had asserted his own version of liberty, the freedom to dissent from destructive authority. He had not only saved the Narragansett, but he had perhaps saved the settlement from a premature, devastating war. The shadow of the Baron was gone, replaced by the far more dangerous shadow of mass hysteria, which he had successfully challenged. The immediate crisis was averted, but Elias knew the price would be high. He had publicly shamed Prescott and challenged the rigid worldview of men like Jedediah. He was now an outcast among the men he had just saved. The settlers would never fully trust him. The Narragansett would never truly forget his intervention. He had chosen his path, the path of truth over tribe, and now he had to live with the consequences amidst the settlers, amidst the ruins, the cost of survival, certainly. Following the intense climax, here is the 800-word segment under the subtitle, Amidst the Ruins, the Cost of Survival, focusing on the immediate fallout and the personal toll of Elias's actions. Amidst the ruins, the cost of survival, the silence that fell upon Dorchester after the confrontation was heavier than any storm. The patrol dispersed, not in triumph or unity, but in shame and sullen resentment. Elias had saved them from an atrocity, but in doing so, he had exposed their baseless fear and the shaky foundation of their authority. He was not hailed as a hero. He was ostracized as a dangerous dissident, a man who placed the word of the heathen over the presumptive righteousness of the colony's leaders. The cost of survival was isolation. Jedediah Morse, whose face had been a mask of shattered certainty at the riverbank, could not reconcile his fury with his deep-seated shame. The next morning he confronted Elias, his piety weaponized. "You sow doubt where God demands conviction, Thorn," Jedediah declared, his voice a low, hostile rumble. "You stood with the savages against your own people. The devil finds purchase in the heart of the skeptic. I cannot harbor you and your wife any longer. It is ungodly." The eviction was immediate and harsh. Elias and Clara were forced back to their small, half-cleared plot, taking with them only their tools and a meager sack of Jedediah's poorest grain. The small temporary room they had occupied for weeks was now denied, and the few logs Elias had cut were lost to Jedediah's ownership. The temporary, unlikely alliance had been sacrificed at the altar of truth. Clara, though loyal, was heartbroken. She surveyed their unfinished plot, the haphazard piles of rock, the two-log cabin frame covered only by the thinning ship's tarp, with a desperate weariness. "We risked the king's jail for freedom, Elias," she murmured, her eyes distant. "But what kind of freedom is this? We are alone, and winter is upon us." Elias stood amidst the ruins of his social standing. His skilled hands, which could have earned him comfortable living in the colony, were now useless because no settler would hire him. Prescott had ensured that the whispers traveled fast. Elias Thorne was unreliable, dangerous, perhaps even an agent of the Narragansett. He had trade skills, but no one in Dorchester would trade with him. The true trial began now. A solitary race against the elements, without the help, resources, or community of the settlement. Elias had to build a fully enclosed shelter capable of withstanding the legendary New England winter, and he had to do it using only his own labor and Clara's assistance. The days became a blur of frantic, desperate labor. Elias started by building a low, sturdy stone foundation, utilizing the thousands of rocks Clara had painstakingly collected. He then worked on the cabin walls, notching the heavy oak logs with meticulous, feverish speed. He learned to work through the ache of his healing leg, through the biting frost that now coated the ground every morning, and through the persistent, gnawing fear in his stomach. Clara's resourcefulness was their only saving grace. She had learned enough from the settlers to begin curing meat, and she found a thick stand of white cedar bark that Elias used to patch and weatherproof the roof. She often cooked their meager meals over a small fire, watching the woods with a vigilance born of fear. One freezing evening, a sound brought them both upright. It was not the howl of a wolf or the crack of a branch, but a soft, rhythmic tap at the edge of the firelight. Elias cautiously approached the shadow, axe in hand. Standing there was Woonigan, the Narragansett spokesman, cloaked in furs. He stood alone, unarmed, holding a bundle wrapped in hide. Woonigan spoke in the slow, careful English he had picked up from trading posts. "You stopped the guns. You spoke the truth of the water, my people. They do not forget the debt." He extended the bundle. Inside were several cured deer hides, thick and soft, and a large slab of smoked fish, a bounty of sustenance and warmth that was priceless on the edge of winter. Elias could only stare. This was not the forgiveness of the townspeople, offered grudgingly after weeks of penance. This was a clear, direct recognition of his singular act of justice. He was an outcast among his own kind, but he had, unknowingly, earned a measure of respect from the people he was told were his enemies. "Thank you," Elias managed, his voice thick with emotion. Woonigan nodded, his eyes meeting Elias's with a profound understanding. "The truth. It is a strong house. Build your house strong." With that, Woonigan faded back into the dark forest, a shadow among shadows. Elias and Clara survived that first brutal winter largely thanks to the hide and the fish. But the deeper lesson was clear. Their survival was purchased at a high price. They were forever separated from the easy comfort of community, viewed with suspicion by the colony. Yet, they had gained something invaluable: self-reliance and a unique, fragile bridge to the very wilderness that surrounded them. Their home, built amidst the ruins of their past loyalties, stood as a monument to the integrity they refused to compromise, forging a new identity, the seeds of a nation. The winter of 1636 broke the spirit of many in Dorchester, but for Elias and Clara, huddled within their small stone-based cabin, it became the crucible of their new identity. Cut off from the colony, they learned to depend solely on their own ingenuity and the unexpected gesture of aid from Woonigan. The deer hides became their warmest blankets, and the smoked fish staved off famine. Their survival was a rejection of the colonial ideal that only group conformity guaranteed safety, and an embrace of a far more potent American philosophy: radical self-reliance. When spring finally arrived, Elias's labor shifted from frantic building to patient, meticulous cultivation. He used his stonemason's eye to clear the remaining rocks from their meager plot, stacking them into low, precise boundary walls. This was more than just clearing. It was an act of defining. Every stone laid was a silent declaration of ownership, not inherited from a baron, but earned through blood, sweat, and defiance. Clara, meanwhile, became the architect of their sustained life. She utilized the limited knowledge gained from the native gift, applying it to their English seeds. She learned which wild greens were safe to eat, how to gather sap for sweeteners, and how to track the small game that had eluded Elias's less experienced eye. They were no longer English peasants clinging to tradition. They were becoming something new, frontiers people, blending old-world skills with the harsh, practical wisdom of the new. The isolation, while painful, allowed Elias to shed the social constraints of his past. He no longer worried about Jedediah's sermons or Prescott's judgment. He worked on his own schedule, answered to his own conscience, and measured his worth by the height of the cabin walls and the depth of the furrowed rows. This freedom was the ultimate fulfillment of the lure of liberty, and it was here, on this remote, hard-won patch of ground, that the seeds of a nation were sown. Elias's reputation, however, began to shift subtly. While the pious settlers in the heart of Dorchester still whispered about his loyalty, his craftsmanship spoke louder than gossip. Men started hearing about the small, sturdy cabin on the edge of the woods, a building that had survived the vicious winter better than some older colonial structures. One blisteringly hot afternoon, Thomas Kent, a pragmatic farmer whose barn roof had partially collapsed, approached Elias. Thomas was not a member of Prescott's inner circle. He was simply a man facing ruin. He approached Elias's plot nervously, his desperation overriding his prejudice. "Thorne," Thomas began stiffly, "I need my roof fixed before the rains come, quickly and soundly. They say your work holds." Elias looked Thomas in the eye, not with bitterness, but with a quiet confidence born of survival. "My fee is not in shillings, Kent," Elias stated. "It is in barter. I need 10 pounds of seed corn, half a day's use of your oxen, and the promise that you will not speak of my character, only the quality of my stone." Thomas, desperate, readily agreed. The transaction was a small, profound moment of cultural change. Elias was operating outside the king's economy and outside the colony's social hierarchy. He was defining his own value based purely on skill and need, a proto-capitalist act of self-determination. Elias completed the roof repair in record time, his restored confidence shining through his precise work. Thomas Kent paid the requested barter, and word spread, not through the church sermon, but through the need of practical men. Elias Thorne was a necessary resource regardless of his opinions. His most defining work, however, was in stone. Utilizing his mastery, he began carving simple, elegant gravestones for settlers who had perished that winter, including the 2 drowned boys. He charged no fee, offering his service as a silent, profound contribution to the community that had rejected him. On the stones, he carved not ornate English titles, but simple, powerful declarations: "Son of the new land, taken by the water." These stones, carved by a skeptical hand, were the first physical markers of a distinct American identity, emphasizing belonging to the land rather than to the crown. Elias realized that his true power lay not in fighting the colony's politics, but in building its foundations, literally and figuratively. He was an architect of the new frontier, a man who had forged his identity from the ruins of the old world's rigid class structure and the constant threat of the new world's wildness. He had found his liberty not in an abstract decree, but in the tangible, undeniable reality of his own creation. He and Clara had survived, proving that the true strength of this burgeoning nation would reside not in the collective obedience, but in the fierce, independent spirit of the individual. Legacy and the long road, home 2 decades melted away, marked not by the king's calendar, but by the relentless cycle of seasons on Elias and Clara's remote land. The tiny, crude cabin had grown into a sturdy, 2-story farmhouse of stone and massive oak timbers, its foundation deep and its roof sound, a testament to Elias's uncompromising craftsmanship and their mutual endurance. Their plot, once a menacing thicket, was now a productive farm, surrounded by the strongest stone walls in the county. They had raised 4 children, 3 sons and a daughter, all born under the roof Elias had built. Knowing no home but this frontier, Elias Thorne, the fugitive stonemason, had become Deacon Thorne in the eyes of his neighbors, though he never held an official title. His moral clarity at the riverbank 20 years prior had finally earned him a grudging, deep-seated respect. When disputes arose over land boundaries, timber rights, or the allocation of community labor, settlers sought out Elias, not Captain Prescott or Jedediah Morse, both long since deceased, because his judgment was known to be fair, practical, and unburdened by dogma. His legacy was built on integrity, not inheritance. His children embodied the new identity he had forged. They possessed the sturdy practicality of the English craftsman combined with the silent, observant knowledge of the wilderness. They knew the land intimately, how to read the clouds and how to speak the rudimentary trade language of the Narragansett, a peace maintained since that critical moment of reckoning. Elias watched them, strong, free, self-assured, and saw the true realization of the lure of liberty. However, as the children grew and began establishing their own frontier lives, a new kind of yearning settled upon Elias. The past, which had once felt like a heavy shadow he needed to outrun, now began to call to him with the soft, faint whisper of memory. He was 70 years old, his hands still firm but his gait slower. He started dreaming of the smell of the sea in Cornwall, the chime of the church bells, and the sight of the worn cobblestones where he had first learned his trade. He realized he had never truly completed his escape. He had only run to a new place. The long road home was not about returning to England, but about reconciling with his own past. One autumn afternoon, while sitting on the porch with Clara, the sun warming the granite steps he had laid, Elias spoke of his long-held secret, the warrant for the sundial's destruction, the fear of debtor's prison, and the finality of their flight. Clara, now silver-haired but with the same fierce light in her eyes, simply nodded. "I knew we were running from more than the Baron's whim, Elias. I just knew you ran with good cause." "I never had the courage to look back," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I have built a free life, but I was always afraid to face the beginning of the journey." He felt the weight of that unfinished chapter. His flight had been a necessary act of rebellion, but it was also a severance, a clean break from his own lineage and roots. He wanted his children to know their heritage, not as a source of oppression, but as a source of their skilled hands and quiet strength. Elias decided on one final journey. Not across the Atlantic, but back to the place he had first landed, the crowded, established colonial port of Boston, a bustling mini-Europe compared to the quiet simplicity of his farm. He rode Thomas Kent's sturdy pony, taking only a small purse and his walking stick. Boston was loud, dirty, and densely populated. He saw men in powdered wigs and brocaded coats, a new colonial elite who mirrored the aristocracy he had fled. He felt like a wilderness relic in this evolving society. His quest was simple: find a man who remembered the early days. He located an aged, retired scrivener named Mr. Finch who kept dusty records of the first ships. After hours of careful searching and a generous bribe, Finch found the entry: Elias Thorne, arriving 1636, listed as a fugitive for willful damage and unpaid debt to Baronet Rees. The name of the baronet and the specific charge, the sundial, was preserved in the old ink. Elias stared at the words. The crime was so trivial, so foolishly petty, yet it had shaped the entire course of his life and the legacy of his family. He felt a profound sense of closure. The threat was just words on paper, a faded memory in a distant land. It no longer held power over him. He bought a single, smooth piece of fine English granite, the kind he had once worked with daily. He returned to his farm a week later, physically exhausted, but spiritually renewed. He carved one final piece of stone, a simple, unadorned sundial. He placed it in the center of their garden. He carved 2 dates, the year he left England and the current year. Underneath, he carved a single phrase: Ex umbra in solum, from shadow into sun. Elias Thorne had finally reconciled the old world shadow with the light of his new world liberty. His home, his family, and his integrity were his lasting legacy. The long road home was not a trip to England. It was the journey from fear to acceptance, from running to standing still on his own, free soil. Of course, this final segment, where the future begins, the unwritten chapter, will serve as the conclusion, reflecting on Elias's completed journey and looking forward to the legacy his family will carry into the developing American nation. Where the future begins. The unwritten chapter, Elias. Thorne died peacefully in his sleep one late spring morning. The scent of blooming apple trees drifting through the open window of the farmhouse he had built with his own hands. He was buried on his land, under the clear New England sky, his grave marked by a simple granite headstone, not one he had carved himself, but one cut by his eldest son, a man whose hands bore the same honest calluses. Clara. Now the matriarch mourned him deeply, but without bitterness. Their life had been hard-won, but fully lived. She looked out at the thriving farm, the neatly stacked firewood, and the robust stone walls, the silent, tangible evidence of their legacy. Elias had not left them a manor or a title, but he had left them something far more valuable, sovereignty over their own lives and a blueprint for survival built on truth, skill, and independence. The gathering after the burial was a quiet, profound affair. It was attended not just by his children and grandchildren, but by neighbors from Dorchester, including the grandsons of Jedediah Morse and Thomas Kent. Even a few familiar faces from the Narragansett, led by Wonigan's son, arrived to pay their respects, a silent, enduring testament to the justice Elias had championed decades prior. The man who had been an outcast was now a cornerstone. During the quiet meal, Elias's son, Arthur, spoke of his father's last carved piece, the sundial bearing the inscription, Ex umbra in solum, from shadow into sun. Father, Arthur said, his voice husky with emotion, did not fear the dark, but he valued the light. He taught us that the only authority a man must answer to is the truth of his conscience and the call of his work. This philosophy was the true unwritten chapter Elias bequeathed to his family, and, by extension, to the burgeoning nation. The colony of Massachusetts Bay was rapidly evolving. The rigid Puritan strictures were slowly bending under the weight of trade, expansion, and the sheer practicality of frontier life. Men like Elias Thorne, who had lived on the margins, relying on their own moral compass rather than imposed laws, were the spiritual seeds of the new nation's character. Elias's grandchildren represented the literal future. They were entirely American, born of the wilderness and the hard-won liberty. They were not running from a shadow. They were walking into the sun. His granddaughter, Ilara, possessed her grandmother's quiet intelligence and her grandfather's sharp eye for geometry. She often sat by the river, sketching the stone patterns and the fortifications her grandfather had built. She recognized that the lines of his craftsmanship were not merely functional. They were statements of permanence, a desire to root something stable in a world of constant flux. One evening, Ilara discovered the small, original wooden deed tucked into Elias's old chest, the flimsy piece of paper that represented the initial plot of land. It was almost illegible, yet it held immense power. Beside it, she found a single smooth piece of gray English granite that Elias had brought back from Boston, upon which he had never carved a thing. Ilara took both items, the fragile deed and the untouched stone, to her grandmother Clara. "Grandmother," Ilara asked, "what should we do with this stone?" "It's the last piece of England he ever touched." Clara took the stone, feeling its cool weight, and then touched the deed. She smiled, her eyes distant with memory. "Your grandfather, my dear, finished all his necessary carving. He built his house, he marked his own way, and he wrote his own ending," Clara said softly. "That stone is not for us to finish. It is a beginning. It is the unwritten chapter. It is for you to decide what foundation comes next." Ilara understood. The granite represented the foundational strength of the old world, the skill, the knowledge, the connection to tradition. But it was delivered blank to the new world. Her generation was free to engrave upon it their own purpose, their own set of ideals, unconstrained by the shadow that had driven Elias. The story of Elias Thorne, the fugitive stonemason, ended not with him. but with the generations he freed. His act of defiance at the river, his lonely struggle against the wilderness, and his stubborn pursuit of integrity had created a safe harbor where the future could be conceived. His home stood at the edge of the Dorchester settlement, not as a boundary, but as a bridge, a place where English law met native wisdom, where individual liberty trumped collective conformity, and where the future truly began. His life was a microcosm of the very struggle that would, a century later, define the American Revolution. The fight for the right to self-govern, built stone by stone, truth by truth, from shadow into sun.